They called it the worst journey in the world. Just imagine this. It's the middle of World War II. You're a young sailor, barely in your 20s, and instead of being sent to fight in sunny Italy or the deserts of North Africa, you're ordered to board a merchant ship packed with fuel, tanks, and ammunition, and your mission is to sail through the deadliest waters on Earth, the Arctic Ocean. Sounds like a nightmare already, right? Well, for the men of the Arctic Convoys, this nightmare was their daily reality. And let me be clear, when historians say worst journey, they're not exaggerating. Out of every 100 men who left for Russia, 89 would never return. That's not war, that's a death sentence dressed up as duty. But why was it so deadly? Let's set the stage. The Soviet Union was being pounded relentlessly by the German war machine. Without food, fuel, and weapons from Britain and America, they might have collapsed. The only way to deliver that lifeline was by sea. Across icy waters where German U-boats lurked below, Luftwaffe bombers prowled above, and storms rolled in so vicious they could snap a steel ship in half. This wasn't just a supply run. This was a fight for survival against both nature and the enemy. You see, the Arctic didn't care if you wore an Allied uniform or carried the Nazi flag. If you fell into those waters, you were dead in less than 5 minutes. Brutal doesn't even begin to describe it. And here's the part that blows my mind. The men who signed up for these convoys knew the odds. They weren't expecting glory, they weren't promised riches, and they sure weren't guaranteed survival. So why did they go? Duty, brotherhood, and maybe a little bit of madness, because if you think about it, who in their right mind would say, sure, I'll sail straight into an Arctic storm with torpedoes flying past me? Yet thousands did, and that's where we uncovered the real story. The courage buried beneath the ice. Let's pause here for a second. Imagine being on one of those ships. It's pitch black, the deck is coated in ice, and you can't even smoke a cigarette because one tiny spark could reveal your position to a U-boat. Now tell me, honestly, would you volunteer for that? Or would you suddenly remember you had urgent business back home? Exactly. It makes you wonder about the kind of steel running through those sailors.
Now, let's talk about the enemy. The German Navy, especially the dreaded U-boats, turned these seas into a graveyard. Convoys would set out with 40 or 50 ships, and sometimes only a handful reached Russia. Survivors described watching entire convoys vanish overnight. One moment, you're sailing alongside a friendly ship. The next, a torpedo sends it exploding into fire and black smoke. And here's the cruel twist. Even if you jumped into the water to escape, the Arctic would kill you faster than the Germans could. Imagine having to choose your death: fire, drowning, or freezing. How's that for a multiple-choice test from hell? But survival wasn't just about dodging U-boats. The Arctic storms were merciless. Waves the size of buildings smashed into convoys, tearing lifeboats from their davits and sweeping sailors overboard like ragdolls. And the cold? It was an enemy all its own. Frostbite could set in during your night watch, turning your fingers black before you even realized it. This wasn't Hollywood war with dramatic speeches and orchestral music. This was grinding, bone-crushing endurance, where just living through one night felt like a victory. And yet, they kept going. Each successful convoy that reached Russia meant tanks rolling onto the Eastern Front, aircraft fueling up to fight the Luftwaffe, and food filling the bellies of starving soldiers and civilians. Without these voyages, the Soviet Union might have fallen, and the entire war could have tipped in Hitler's favor. Think about that. A group of frozen, half-starved sailors in the Arctic might have been the reason D-Day even had a chance to succeed. Incredible, right? But here's where the story gets darker. In one of the most infamous disasters, Convoy PQ-17 in 1942, the Admiralty panicked over reports that the German battleship Tirpitz was coming to attack. They ordered the convoy to scatter, leaving merchant ships defenseless. What followed was pure carnage. Of the 35 merchant ships, only 11 reached Russia. The rest were sunk, torn apart by bombs, torpedoes, and shells. Hundreds of men died alone in the freezing sea. Survivors later said it was the closest thing to hell they had ever seen. And the worst part? Tirpitz never even showed up. So now we face the question, how did men survive this nightmare voyage knowing each trip could be their last? And what drove them to sail again and again into the jaws of death? The answer reveals not just strategy and history, but something deeper, the human spirit under impossible pressure. But hold on, before we dive into their survival stories, let me throw you a little twist. Imagine you're on a convoy and suddenly one of the biggest German battleships in history, armed with guns that could blow your ship in half with a single shot, is reported heading your way. What do? Fight, flee, or pray? That's exactly the cliffhanger we'll pick up in part 2, because trust me, this story only gets more brutal.
So there you are, standing on the frozen deck, staring into the dark horizon, knowing that the mighty German battleship Tirpitz could appear at any moment. For many sailors, this wasn't just a rumor. It was a constant fear that hung over every convoy. And yet, they kept sailing. They manned their guns, watched the skies, and prayed that the convoy would hold together just long enough to reach Russia. That's the kind of quiet courage that rarely makes it into history books. And here's the truth. The Arctic convoys broke men, but they also made heroes. Sailors endured storms that could crush a ship, enemy attacks that turned nights into infernos, and a cold so bitter it could kill in minutes. But their sacrifice paid off. The supplies they delivered helped the Soviet Union push back the German army, turning the tide of the war on the Eastern Front. Without them, the story of World War II might have ended very differently, and not in our favor. Today, when we think of the great battles of the war, Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway, the Arctic convoys are often forgotten. But for those who sailed them, every voyage was its own battle, every wave its own enemy, and every survivor a miracle. Their story is a reminder of what true endurance, brotherhood, and sacrifice look like when the odds are stacked against you. So, the next time you hear someone say history is boring, ask them this: would they survive 5 minutes in the Arctic convoys? My guess? Probably not. And that's why this story matters, because the men who faced the worst journey in the world weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the future. If you found this story powerful, don't stop here. Check out my video on the forgotten naval battles of World War II, where you'll discover even more untold stories of courage, tragedy, and survival. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss the history that textbooks leave out.